the ancient town of Aleppo in northern Syria, there occurred at the end of the First World War a tremendous awakening among the few thousand Armenians who had survived the horrors of the genocide in Turkey. Because of Aleppo's commercial importance, Armenians had settled and prospered there as early as the 13th century. During periods of Ottoman oppression, many of these early Armenians of Aleppo lived in underground caverns beneath their churches. Under the church of Karasun Mandats, known as the Church of 30 Children, there were huge secret chambers. The miracle of Cilicia Rebirth in Aleppo in the early part of the 20th century has its roots in the destruction of the last kingdom of Greater Armenia. In the 11th century, Seljuk Turks from Central Asia overran the Armenian plateau. Armenian princes and barons, together with their armies and vast populations, migrated southward to Galicia, to the shores of the Mediterranean. Under Prince Reuben, they established a principality in 1080, which a century later became a kingdom. This was a region of enormous strategic and commercial importance. For 300 years, Galician Armenia was a place of prospering trade and thriving cities, a place of genuine civilization. Beset by hostile forces from the east and from the west, it was a constant struggle to maintain the Christian faith. The 12th and 13th centuries were periods of creativity and progress, known as the Silver Age of Armenian culture. During this era, the religious poetry of Catholicos Narcissus Shamaravi the Gracious and the manuscript illustrations of Taurus Roslan attained great heights. Learning, culture, and art flourished. The Armenian kingdom of Galicia had come into being during a stormy period of European history. The First Crusade arrived in Galicia in 1096, a scant generation after the establishment of the First Armenian Principality. The Crusader knights were welcomed by the Armenians, who provided provisions and military equipment. With their fortifications and castles, the Armenians guarded the rear flank of the Crusaders. Marriage and a common faith, basic solidarity between the two groups remained for a full 200 years. Finally, in 1375, the Mamluk forces of Egypt subdued the Armenian kingdom of Galicia. The period of Ottoman Turkish rule that was to follow submerged the Armenian population into a long night that was to last some 600 years. Prior to the First World War, several 100,000 Armenians lived in Galicia. Here was a land facing the open seas to the west, a place of gardens and gentle hills. The Armenians shared with the Turks the towns of the area: Marash, Adana, Sis, Antad. The rugged landscape was similar to Greater Armenia, where their forefathers had lived. Most Armenians were engaged in agriculture and lived in mountain villages. As a rule, the Armenians were successful in the commercial life of the towns. They were the scribes, the carpenters, the shopkeepers, were weavers. Many Armenians were in the professions, principally in medicine, nursing, teaching, and the ministry. In many ways, the Armenian intellectual class was oriented to the West. In Aintab, the American missionaries had established the Central Turkey College. Almost all its faculty and students were Armenian. Christianity was the central force in the life of the Armenian community. The Armenian Catholic Church of Aintab, for example, was one of the most imposing sanctuaries in the region. Protestantism was particularly strong in Cilicia. The Apostolic, or National Church, retained its traditional dominant role in the religious and cultural life of the Armenians. This church was governed by a Catholicos who had his seat in the Galician capital at Sis. Prior to the First World War, the Armenian Apostolic Church supported hundreds of churches and schools in Cilicia. During centuries of harsh Ottoman rule, dominant Turkish ways and customs had made changes in Armenian life. For example, the Turkish fez had been accepted as a headgear by the Garabed and Musia Akbabian family, as by most other Armenians of the area. Armenians had been forced to use the Turkish language until they were no longer able to speak their native tongue. But their faith remained Christian, and their outlook was Western. They were a proud people. As the early years of the 20th century arrived, the Armenian leaders were not aware of impending doom. They were soon to be destroyed. Ministers, artists, scientists, doctors, professors, lawyers, and craftsmen were to be massacred. The genocide of 1915 brought to an end the centuries-old, uneasy Armenian and Turkish coexistence. After the defeat of Turkey in the First World War, the French occupied Cilicia for a brief period. With the sudden departure of the French in January 1922, a second genocide was in the making. A good portion of the Armenian population of Cilicia was saved, however, due in large part to the Armenian defenders of Aintab, led by Adil Livonian and other volunteers. Men and women joined together to dig trenches. There were no bullets and grenades. The defense of Aintab prevented a new massacre at the hands of the Turks, but bravery alone could not preserve a homeland for the Armenians. The Armenian defenders and survivors of Cilicia left their ancient homeland, never to return. Behind them remained ruined cities, torn down homes, churches and public buildings, and a few stranded old people. The aftermath of the genocide was everywhere. Many Armenian women and girls had been abducted by Turks as slaves and concubines. The genocide of 1915 destroyed more than half of the Armenian people living under Turkish domination. Forced deportation routes led the Armenians to the Syrian desert, to the city of Aleppo. The Arabs, who also had suffered under Turkish rule, welcomed the Armenians in their midst. At that time, Syria was a distant outpost of the Ottoman Empire, populated by Arabs who wanted independence. Following the war, Syria was freed from Turkey and came under French mandatory rule. Aleppo, the major city of northern Syria, became the gathering place for destitute, homeless Armenians who had survived the massacres and the deportations. Within sight of the ancient fortress of Aleppo, the Armenians were to find a new home. Beginning in 1916, a remnant of a people arrived in Aleppo. Only a handful of people from the once prosperous kingdom of Cilicia, no more than 20,000, faced an uncertain future. Gathered in small groups, they stood on the edge of a strange Arab town, full of bitter memories of forefathers always driven out of a homeland. Yet their first thought was to affirm their Christian faith by building houses of worship. Out of this wretched group, moving in slums and caves, the spirit of a once great and glorious kingdom was to be resurrected. During their moment of greatest anguish, they did not know or ever dream how far they would rise. The American and European missionaries had been active in Cilicia for several decades. The missionaries had disapproved of establishing an Armenian political existence. After the genocide, they were careful not to offend Turks by championing Armenian calls for justice, although they remained generous in their relief programs. Armenian organizations and all-line Armenian families of Aleppo also helped their destitute compatriots. Together with American and French relief groups, they set up bread lines and soup kitchens. The tattered and destitute survivors from Cilicia and from other parts of historical Armenia settled into slums as squatters on land they did not own. A new life was started, at last, without fear of massacre. Conditions in the slums were dangerous and unsanitary. Disease was rampant. Children's mortality rate was high. Tuberculosis and trachoma were common. Vandalism and alcoholism were widespread. They tried to maintain an ethnic identity by seeking to live together with others from the same town in the homeland. There was a Marash camp, an Orfa camp. The survivors of Zeytun, Aintab, Erzurum, Harapet, Gurun, and Kilis dwell in other sections of the shantytown. Always, there was the search for lost ones. Abducted girls and women were rescued from Turkish harems. Orphans were found in the desert. A people scattered, as if by a violent storm, were being gathered. Despair engulfed particularly the children and youth, but feelings of freedom and nationalism dominated their thoughts. A European missionary observed that the youth had become anxious to learn about their national history. She said, "They listen with great attention to those who talk of revenge. They have talent, but do not know what direction to go." In the ancient homeland, education had always been an important part of traditional Armenian life. Now, bed sheets separated the makeshift classrooms. The traditional apprenticeship system had broken down during the massacres and deportations. Now, they started to refashion life by reviving old skills and talents in carpentry, needlework, weaving. conditions were crowded. Several families often lived together in a single room. Nursery schools were set up by volunteer groups. Slowly, families were reunited, with each passing month. Better housing, more food, better clothing, and leisure time were available. By 1925, there were almost 40,000 Armenian refugees in Aleppo. Half of them were living in the camps. In the rest of Syria, there were about another 100,000 Armenians. Among them were many widows whose husbands had perished during the genocide. They were learning new trades and taking leadership roles in the community. The cost of living was escalating due to the general adverse economic climate of Syria. Most refugees were unemployed, so the Armenians started to build their own cottage industries. In the mid-1920s, almost 40% of the Armenian labor force was occupied with needlework and rug weaving. By the late 1920s, the Armenians had been squatters in the slums for over 6 years. They had built homes and factories. The landlords were clamoring to move them out and get back their properties. In 1945, the Syrian courts gave the Armenian squatters 1 year to destroy the slums, their homes, and places of work. It was a desperate situation for the Armenians. A fervor gripped the community. A group of city Armenians came together to purchase land for the refugees. Volunteer cooperatives were formed for resettlement. Lumber was parceled out. Old shacks were torn down. Vartan Darunian was there to record remarkable images. As a master photographer, he was decades ahead of his time. He was a superb candid cameraman. He captured the transformation of the town and the spirit of the people who made it possible. The new buildings were constructed with brick, stone, and mortar. Meanwhile, fellow Arab neighbors watched in wonder. Reverend Mirza Salyan, in Arab garb, and other Armenians preached the gospel to their new Arab neighbors. At the beginning, the land was barren. Within the space of 3 years, the Armenians had built a new city. Other places would experience a revival of Armenian life, but Aleppo was the first place after the First World War to witness on such a large scale the awakening of the Armenian people. A renaissance was in the making, inspired by the fierce will of a people to keep alive its national identity. They built modern streets, shops, and clubs, a new life to erase the tragedy of the past. A unique suburb outside of ancient Aleppo. A new and perhaps better Cilicia. In old Cilicia, the Armenians had achieved a high level of culture. In Aleppo, they sought to recreate their lost civilization. They restored traditions and institutions and gave them new life. The Central Turkey College, commonly known as Aintab College, became Aleppo College. The first faculty consisted of 3 Americans, 2 Arabs, and 10 Armenians. The Aintab School for Girls became the American School for Girls in Aleppo. The administration of these institutions was American, but most of the faculty, the student body, and the moving spirit were Armenian. The teaching faculties from elementary school through college contained an equal number of men and women. An increasing number of women entered the teaching and nursing professions. The Armenians once again established an educational leadership. They built schools, established churches, and organized cultural associations. Aleppo Armenians became influential in Syria. They sent members to the Syrian parliament. Aleppo became one of the major centers of the diaspora. Years later, they had come out of Turkey as refugees, some as young slaves in the Turkish army, uneducated, rough, hopeless. The story of their individual success is illustrated by many examples. Reverend Narses Hachidurian rose from humble beginnings to become a pastor, and later to conduct discussions with Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt. Once a refugee, Archbishop Artavus Tzimayan became the spiritual leader of the Apostolic Church in Aleppo. A survivor from Marash, Zare Payaslian became Archbishop of Aleppo and later Catholicos of the Holy See of Galicia. Zorab Kapralian, one of the Aleppo homeless, became a famous engineer and vice president of the University of Southern California. Reverend Siragan Agbabian, a boy from Tarsus, was to become one of the leaders of the Armenian colony in Aleppo. Robert Jabejan became a renowned medical doctor and an expert in local history. Levon Levonian, a master educator, expanded the curriculum of his school to include the performing arts. As a result, concerts and theatrical productions became widespread. Armenians became athletic champions of Syria. They introduced the Boy Scout movement to the Arab world. They dominated professional athletics, particularly in boxing. They provided generals for the Syrian army. As time went on, the Armenians of Aleppo had demonstrated their ability to produce new leaders, to hold fast to their Christian faith, to keep alive their national aspirations, and to become loyal citizens of Syria. By any standard, the story of the Armenians of Aleppo was an astonishing rebirth of an old spirit in a new place. By 1937, all the slums were gone. A new Galicia, the littlest of Galicias, had been born. The slums of Aleppo were the last breath of the kingdom of Galicia. They were also its final triumph.
Cilicia